So hello everyone and welcome to the Outsourcing for Startups webinar. Thank you all for joining. We've prepared today lots of useful information for both startups and investors. So today we'll be addressing several key advantages that using software outsourcing brings to any startup, but specifically we'll cover how and why this should be a major part of any startup go-to-market strategy. And we have two wonderful speakers with us today. Unfortunately, we were supposed to have three, but Matt Brown couldn't join because he had a conflict. He had some urgent business to take care of. He apologizes. But we have Mark and Rich here today, who both have over 30 years of experience in software engineering and many exciting cases and insights to share with you today. So let's start with some introductions. Hi, Mark.
Hi, how you doing? I'm Mark Andrews. I'm the VP of Marketing and Sales at Waverly. I have, as Arissa said, over 30 years of experience in the software industry. And for about the last 15 years, I've been involved in outsourcing one way or another, either as a consumer or as a provider of outsourcing. And in all of those situations, it didn't matter what size the company, whether it was a startup that I was part of or a big, multinational corporation. The discussions about software development were always about the same things. Discussions about scalability, time to market, quality, and cost of resources. And you're probably having some of these same discussions in your organizations as well. And hopefully today we'll cover a few ways you might be able to solve some of these issues. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Rich.
Hi, thanks, Mark. My name's Rich Sadowski. I am a new employee at Waverly. I joined at the end of December 2020, but I'm not new to Waverly. I was a customer for 7 years. I first used Waverly at Jibo, the home social robot company, and my entire team was Waverly based. And that lasted 5 years. When I joined my next startup, I hired Waverly again, some of the same people, and that was Plannuh, a SaaS enterprise grade SaaS product. My background is I've been developing software for 40 years since I was a teenager, 35 professionally. And of that, almost all of it, with the exception of 6 years at Symantec, has been in startups. So I do have the big company experience. I invented Live Update at Symantec, but startups are sort of my thing, and I derive great enjoyment out of bringing products to life. So I can't think of a stronger endorsement or honor than to be hired by Waverly, a company who has provided me with exceptional service for 7 years. So hopefully I can shed some light on how we achieve that success, or how you could achieve success with any outsourced company. So with that, let's go back to Arissa, I believe.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Rich. So let's start with the basics. Why do people usually turn to outsourcing in the first place? What are the problems that they're trying to solve? And how does outsourcing help? Mark, can you explain this?
Sure. I think that, since this is kind of focused on startups, I'll kind of focus on some of the reasons they turn to outsourcing. So from the investor point of view, or the VC, whoever's investing in this venture, it's pretty simple for them. It's time to market, right? Time to market's very important because their end goal is they have some sort of exit strategy, right? They want to return on their investment as quickly as possible. They either want to go public with the company they've invested in, or they want it to be acquired by Google or Apple. So pretty straightforward there. And then on the startup side of things, similar goal. Right? They want to get to market as quickly as possible too, because they want that VC to continue to invest in. You want to go from seed money to Series A, Series B, and so forth. But they also want to, in addition to generating revenue, they want to capture market share and mind share. A good example would be maybe Tesla, because look how long they lost money, but they were the electric car company. There was nobody else even could compete really in mind share. So I think the sooner you ship a product, the sooner you can start generating revenue and market share and mind share. And so outsourcing helps you do this. And I think another reason people turn to outsourcing is to reduce risk. And for that topic, I'll hand it over to Rich.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Risk reduction is really important because although you do want to get your product to market as soon as possible, and these days there's Kickstarter, Indiegogo, all of that, you really only have one chance to make a first impression. And so you need to decide what it is that you want to show the world, your first product, whether it's an internal release for investors. And risk reduction involves every decision you make, from who you partner with to the type of software development methodology you use. I am a big believer in diversity. I believe that teams that have diverse people from different backgrounds, different skill levels, different cultures, a mix of men and women, I think that you benefit from all of these points of view. So one element of risk reduction is diversity, and using an outsourcing firm can really help you achieve diversity. Also, risk reduction involves ramping up quickly, and it is hard to hire people. I am in the Boston area, Boston, Massachusetts. We have Harvard, we have MIT, we have all of these Ivy League schools, and you still can't hire people. There are more jobs than there are qualified people. So you reduce risk by diversifying the geographical areas that you go to. And this has been true for the whole 40 years that I've been doing this. I've always found that the wider the variety of people, insights, experiences, educational, the better. So on that note, we'll talk more about risk reduction as parts of onboarding, kickstarting, but Arissa, let's move on to the next topic.
Well, I'll speak for Arissa. Because I think the next thing that reason people turn to outsourcing is cost, right? So people want to control or reduce cost. And when we talk about cost, that seems really obvious, right? It's like, okay, I can go offshore and I can find a really inexpensive engineer. And so people get kind of focused on hourly rates and monthly rates and stuff like that. And that's important. I'm not saying it isn't, but you have to take a look at the total cost of involving yourself with a third party, right? So the example I like to use, and I think Rich just kind of touched on it actually a minute ago, is if you could hire all employees, would you do that? Well, yeah, you could. Maybe it might take you a year to staff up, enough engineers to do what you want to do. And in that time, you'd be interviewing candidates, and your best developers would be spending a lot of hours doing interviews. In fact, it's kind of funny. I worked for a company once where the CTO said, we're not going to outsource anything. We're going to do everything in-house. And I can't even tell you how many hours were wasted with the top engineers in that company doing interviews. So in that case, there was a lot of productivity that was lost. And there's other things to consider, such as, the region, time zone, productivity. If you're a startup in Silicon Valley, it's going to be very, very difficult to find enough engineers at an affordable cost. And you're going to burn through that initial investment very, very quickly. But you could go offshore and you could build a team, pretty reasonably. So cost should be measured not only by hard dollar cost, which is the thing I said before about hourly and monthly, but also by the time spent and time saved.
Thank you, Mark. This is good information, but I guess many of the people in the audience today can have very limited experience with hiring outsourcing vendors. So how does this work in practice? How do you make sure all of this works?
That's a really good question. And I think before you even approach an outsourcing company, there's a lot of questions you should be asking yourself. For example, if you're using an outsourcing company to build a product, what are you building exactly? Are you trying to build an MVP, a fully realized initial release, a commercial grade product? And what you want to build, do you have a realistic budget for it? Does your budget match what you're going to build? And if you're adding engineers to an existing team, so let's say you're a small startup, you've got, the founder and a couple of other engineers and you're cranking along and now you need to scale the team. You should ask yourself, how will these engineers fit with my team? Are there too many senior engineers? Should I have a broader mix of talent? Should I have a project manager? Do I need QA engineers? That kind of thing.
May I interject, Mark?
Sure.
Because one of the points that I missed in my handoff to Arissa there was exactly where you're going right now. We have to understand that when a startup is engaging an outsourcing firm, there are many different levels of experience of that entrepreneur. They may be a software developer themselves. They may not be. So one of the things that has to happen early in the process are dialogues about methodologies. What techniques are you going to use to develop this software? As Mark said, there are models such as product development, where the outsource firm develops the whole thing, soup to nuts, and there's staff augmentation. There's all these different methods. And some of the most important conversations are around questions like project management, quality assurance, automation, DevOps, infrastructure as code, deployment. These are technical terms, but if you don't discuss these up front, you're going to be shooting darts at a dartboard, just trying to guess who to hire. So like any great engagement, it all starts with effective communication. And from there, you then select tools, technology, personality profiles of the people you're looking for, seniority. As Mark mentioned, a very common mistake is hiring all senior engineers without any junior engineers. The reason why that is not super effective is senior engineers don't want to do some of the grunt work or some of the tasks that are less appealing, whereas a junior engineer eats that up and longs for the mentorship to do it. So balancing the team is really important. And your HR practice, the practice of your outsourcing HR firm, that's going to be where the rubber hits the road, and how good you are at that.
Mm-hmm.
So, Rich, you're talking about this like initial communication and all the questions that have to be answered before you start. And what about the kickoff, the project kickoff? What's your maybe advice on doing it right?
Yeah. So great question, Arissa. I believe that you want to be having some good dialogues, before a kickoff meeting. You want to really learn who you're working with. Much like if you're taking a job at a new company, you want to get to know the people. My personal philosophy, which has worked really well for me, and I recognize that not everyone can do this, is I really want to meet the team. And what that means to me is when I hired a team at Jibo, it started with 5 people. There was one of me and 5 of them. So I flew to Kharkiv, Ukraine for a week, and we actually held a kickoff meeting. And in that kickoff meeting, we did everything from introduce each other to discuss the types of collaboration tools, the methodologies, whether we wanted to use Scrum, Kanban, 2-week sprints, what our policies around code review were, how we manage risk throughout the phases of the life cycle. And in 1 week, I am quite sure in retrospect that we probably saved a year's worth of work because we started with a shared understanding of the vision, the methodology, the various different opinions of members of the team. And obviously you tweak that stuff, you continue to evaluate it, you hold retrospective meetings, but I really believe the kickoff meeting is critical. And in today's day and age, it might have to happen over Zoom, it might have to happen over Skype. I don't believe there's specific magic to doing it in person. I just believe that when possible, it's worth it. And so I did the same thing with the second company. When we hired Waverly again at Plannuh, I flew out there, was a new team, new people, new criteria, new culture. Culture is important. A team has a culture. The culture has to be understood. People need to be aligned with it. And one of the most important things, and I really mean this, is you have to establish trust such that if somebody disagrees with you, they feel free to speak up. One of the biggest cancerous things that happen in development teams is a fear to speak up. And it doesn't matter whether it's an outsourcing team or your homegrown team. Junior engineers feel belittled. Brainstorming is not practiced. If you can, as the client, demonstrate to your outsourcing team that you do respect their opinion, that there are no stupid ideas, there are only ideas that may get dropped, that's important. So to me, kickstarting is establishing trust, communication, and the operating norms that you're going to start with. And I say start with because they'll evolve over time. You might find 2 weeks isn't working for you. 4-week sprints are better, or Kanban's better. All kinds of decisions get made. To be successful, you ask questions, you make adjustments, and you execute.
You touched upon trust, and the logical question that I have is about the more practical side of trust when it comes to software engineering projects, because one of the most popular objections and fears that people have that when thinking about outsourcing is the privacy and security side of things. So how would you recommend approaching this, Reg? I know you have great experience in security and in software product security, cloud security. What's your take on this?
Yes, thank you for asking. My 6 years at Symantec taught me a real lot about security and the risks of the internet. And I've also served as an expert witness in litigation about intellectual property. Um, Security and privacy and compliance, I lump them together as similar concepts. And this is absolutely essential. In order for you to even be willing to hire an outsource firm, you need to believe in their integrity. And that, to me, was another reason why I felt it was worth my time to visit the office. But not everyone could do that. But there are little steps that you could take along the way to ensure that you are protected. Among other things, deal with an ethical company. And I believe that Mark is going to cover some of that a little bit later. But you as the client, the hirer, the people who are going to hire you, you control where the repository for the source code is. You control the single sign-on mechanism so that you have the ability when the project's over or when the company goes, drops the product, you could shut everything down. You also need a DevOps practice. DevOps is one of the newer types of engineering that has emerged in the last decade or two. And it's what we used to call system administration, the people who maintain the networks. But today, the networks are all in the cloud. They're ephemeral. And DevOps is a specific practice. And having a strong DevOps professional on your team who understands your security needs, your privacy regulations, what compliance you have to achieve, and what tools will help the team execute fast is critical. So I often say this and people look at me like I'm crazy, but they say, who's your first hire? And I say, my DevOps architect. Because until you establish what the safe parameters are, what the secure functions are, where the databases are stored, you can't be private, you can't be secure. Quick example, no database should ever be accessible over the web, period. If you can access the database over the web, it's a sitting duck. What a DevOps person does for you is they lock that database down so many layers that Edward Snowden couldn't get to it. And then they build the tools through the back end and front end technologies where the queries come in, ask the database and return the results. But if you can connect to that database, you are going to fail every security audit. So you might want to establish what your goals are. Do you want to achieve compliance? Do you want to be SOC 2 compliant? Do you want to achieve a higher level of compliance? Are you bound by regulations? Do you have to comply with GDPR, with CCPA, with HIPAA, with COPA? Whole acronym soup, I call it. There's all these letters, but they all mean something. And to me, you have to start with an understanding of what those delineations are between the systems. And that is a combination of your DevOps professional, your project manager, and your product owner on the client side. Then you bring in the expertise to build out those systems. So I think it's really important to recognize the ever-evolving role of DevOps in modern systems. And in my experience, a lot of people don't understand that role. They think that DevOps is just something that every engineer can do. Maybe so, but maybe not. So you need to establish that trust. I believe that when you hire your DevOps person and you give them the right set of priorities and they're able to demonstrate that they have built the security that you ask for, you are starting out from day one at a level of trust, which is so much higher than the typical level of trust you have when you're building it organically, where no one is responsible for that. I just think that DevOps is the unsung hero of
Yeah.
modern development.
I think
Yes.
our next event should be focused on why companies need DevOps.
Yeah.
I can see that, Rich, you have a lot to share on the topic. But all of these things you mentioned, it seems like there are so many important aspects to keep in mind. And truly, a lot depends on the vendor. So, does who you work with matter? How do you find that perfect partner? What are the things to consider when looking for one? Mark?
Yeah. So I think, let me just finish up real quick on what Rich was saying. I think what he was really saying, I mean, I know he gave DevOps as an example. What he was really saying is that you have to learn the strength of the organization you're working with. And if DevOps is really important to you, then does that organization have, the capability and capacity to do that? Um, so yeah, I think getting back to what you just said, Arissa, there's so many things to consider when you're trying to find the right outsourcing company or even subcontractors or anybody to work with, employees. But I'll focus on what today's topic is, which is startups, identifying the right partners to work with and why. And I'm going to bring up something that I had to learn kind of the hard way, both as a consumer and then when I first started selling outsourcing, and that is ethics, right? And we kind of take it for granted. Everybody should be honest and ethical. And what I found out was that's not necessarily true. I've worked with companies that did things like they'd present one engineer and then really backfill with somebody else that didn't interview with so the customer interviewed one guy, thought he was getting that guy, but he was really getting a junior engineer. I worked for a company that actually did that, and I quit shortly afterwards because I figured if they were willing to do that, they were willing to do a lot of other unethical things, and I was right. So you should be looking at things like, how do they treat their employees? Are the employees paid fairly for that market? Are they honest about who's working on your project from a point of view? Is a full-time engineer really a full-time engineer? Are they charging you for the appropriate skill? In other words, are they honest? So Rich, what's your take on ethics?
Boy, thank you for bringing that up, because that even overshadows DevOps, because ethics to me in business, there is nothing more important. I mean, the top things, are you dealing with ethical people? Are you dealing with, and that of course means honest people. Are you dealing with people with vision? Are you dealing with people who treat their people well? And today there are tools out there. There are tools like Clutch or Glassdoor. Right, good firms. There are lots of tools out there that you could look up to see. Now, you have to understand there's always going to be some sour grapes, but you have to size up the people yourself. And little things like, do they show up for meetings? Do they follow up on what they say? Do they speak clearly about their vision, or is it fuzzy? Ethics to me is a whole spectrum. And there are tools, there are practices, And one way that you can learn about the ethics of a company, either if you are the outsourcing vendor choosing a client or the client choosing the outsourcing vendor, is you could ask questions about what are the best practices that you employ? How do people progress in your organization? The answers to these questions, there's no right or wrong answer, but there are answers that indicate a strong culture. And culture is another word. You
Yeah.
want culture that
Right.
is conducive to good results.
Okay, so I agree, Rich, that I mean, I guess we both agree that ethics are really important. I guess if we're going down a list of things to kind of look at, intellectual property, and the fact that you need to make sure that you own all of the intellectual property that's being developed on your behalf. And so from there, it starts with the contract. Does the contract, if it's ethical and honest, it will spell out very clearly that you own all of the intellectual property. And so I think Rich touched on it earlier about, keeping your intellectual property safe through, your repository and all that. And that's kind of the mechanics, but I'm talking about the ethics side of it. And if a company is ethical and honest, they're going to make sure that it's covered in the contract, B, that you have full control over it, and C, again, this is one of those horror stories, but I'll mention it anyway because it happened. I worked for another company that, if they liked how something worked, they stole those code snippets and reused them for other clients, and they used it as a way of saving time. And that again wasn't ethical. They were taking intellectual property that a customer paid for, and they reused it for another customer and paid and charged them for the same thing. That's an extreme example, but it happens. And again, you have to make sure that that's not a practice that the company you're working with uses.
Mark, one quick comment there
Sure.
is the world has gotten even more complicated in that regard because of the extreme rise of open source software. And
That's a good point.
open source software, first of all, is often a real blessing for getting to market, but it can also be a real nightmare, because what a lot of beginners or non-experienced people, they don't understand that open source software comes with about 50 different licenses, and those licenses may prohibit certain activities. And you are obligated to do things like provide attribution to whose open source you are using. And in your example, for instance, it would not be unethical at all if you used an open source product that you liked and then chose to use it again. That's
Yes.
fair,
Yeah,
right?
that's
But
the
if
point.
you modified it for that other client, that's different. So I think that ethics and honesty and also experience all come into play, because you think that open source makes things easier, but I can actually tell you, when you're raising $100 million for a social robot, the open source that you used is a liability, and you have to
Right.
list every single one. So you want people who know this stuff and can
Yep.
help you navigate it.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think the next, and we'll cover, I think, some of this again further down the line when we talk about a couple of the other things that we're going to cover. But I think the next item on the list is location. And to me, it's not important that every vendor you talk to has 100% coverage of your workday. And of course, there's lots of examples of very good vendors being many time zones away. But I think it's important to have at least some overlap. in the regular business day. Even if it's a couple hours, 2 or 3 hours, it can make a big difference in the way you communicate with the vendor. Um, and because of some of the things that Rich has mentioned earlier, and we've covered already, we've actually gone to the next level and opened 3 different development centers so we could have some coverage in every time zone. In other words, North America, Europe, and Asia, we have overlap because we have 3 development centers. And not to make a commercial for Waverly, but I'm just saying that it's important. It's important to have some sort of overlap because it will keep communication as tight as possible. The next thing to consider, I think, is skill level and expertise. And again, it's a kind of a ambiguous and tricky thing to talk about because, what standard do you use when you're talking about skill level? There is an industry standard, 6 years minimum in the same tech stack, for example, it would be a senior engineer. But the vendor should also be doing internal audits and testing and making sure that a senior engineer really is a senior engineer. Some firms just will put the label on. And so you need to have some way of validating whether or not someone really is a senior. I think the next consideration is attention to detail. You know, are they tracking progress against milestones or goals? Do they take meeting notes? Are they tracking deliverables and the assignments? Are they, doing everything possible to keep your project on schedule? And in order to do that, you have to pay attention to those small details.
Which are especially important when you're working with a team remotely.
Yes.
For you to be able to track those things as well, and for your team existing, if you have one as well.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Sorry, Mark. Software development is a fascinating combination of art and science. And the science part is the details, the tracking, the retrospective, the JIRA bug reports, the bug scrub process. The artistic part is the cleverness of the solution. And this is what I was talking about earlier when I was talking about diversity and even the different locations. And I just wanted to add one quick anecdote. When I was working at Jibo, I ran the server team, I was chief privacy officer, and I ran manufacturing test, which meant that I had Ukrainian meetings at 8 a.m. in the morning and then meetings with China at midnight every day. So you get old fast.
Yeah, well, plus you have to have everybody focused on that attention to detail in order for it to be successful, right? So I think the next thing to consider is, I'll call it accountability, but the example I'll give may be a little bit more on the customer service side. But anyway, accountability is kind of one of those things that you don't really find out until you actually are engaged with an outsourcing company. But I'll give you an example. Let's say you select an engineer and for whatever reason, that person doesn't work out. No one's to blame, but ultimately the outsourcing company needs to fix the problem. How do they fix it? Do they take responsibility for, I mean, like I said, it wasn't necessarily their fault or anybody's fault. It's just that it happened. The engineer all of a sudden was there and now they're not. How do they handle that? Do they quickly backfill an engineer? Do they do some sort of shadowing? Do they credit some time for the ramp up of the new engineer? Do they credit some dollars back? I mean, how do they take care of it? How do they really take ownership and accountability for the relationship with you? So I think that is something to consider, and it's one of those things. Again, it's not something you can really check too well before you start, but it certainly, if something like that comes up, you want to make sure that they handle it correctly. And then I think the next item is consulting. And I think this is really important and appropriate for startups, because think about most startups, right? They are some super bright people who have a great idea, and their idea is so good that some people have injected cash, and invested in that idea, but they might not be very experienced in producing a commercial grade product, right? So working with an outsourcing team that has a lot of experience and can bring that experience over to the startup could be, just a great asset. And I'll give you another example. So a company like we are, and other outsourcing companies have been doing this for a really long time. We have all these things down, like working on writing clear and concise user stories would be a good example, or creating effective communication paths within a team, or learning to identify and manage technical debt, or creating examples of working through and recovering from significant problems. So these can be things that the startup can really take advantage of, and be a great asset. And I think the next thing to talk about really is security, and I have a security expert right here in Rich. So Rich, why don't you kind of tell
I
us
am
how?
a security expert. I will tell you, oh, she moved it. We had one of those little pet cubes here, which is one of those devices that lets you watch your pets. And it was given to my significant other by her son. So I wasn't about to tell her you can't have that. But I put it on its own network because it was a totally unsafe device to be in this house. Security is a very wide-reaching subject. It means something different based on the context of your product. If you are operating a marketing web page, collecting email addresses to market to, your security concerns are still there. There are laws like CAN-SPAN and other laws that apply to you. But if you are making a home social robot designed to go into the houses of families, which was the position I was in, security takes on a monumental presence in your product. And very quick anecdote, I met the founder, the inventor of Jibo, the robot, Cynthia Brazil, a professor at MIT. She told me her story and I was crying. It was the most beautiful product I ever heard. And through my tears, I said to her, "I'm sorry, Cynthia, but I couldn't put that in my house." And she almost started crying, saying, "Why?" And then I explained to her all of the horrific things. And of course, she then said, "What would you do about it?" And the rest is history. I was hired. Security is something that you really have to talk about. One fascinating challenge with security. I was speaking with a company that makes a product that I know many of you are familiar with. And their product is a real security risk. But the CTO told me not one customer has ever asked us about the security of this, right? So sometimes you have to make the decisions about how deep or shallow you go into security based on regulations, based on risk to your brand. And we're not here to just do a commercial on Waverly. We're talking about outsourcing in general, but I will tell you that my experience working with Waverly is when I explain, as a customer this is, when I explained my security requirements, they went away for a week or two and came back to me with a rock solid proposal that showed me that they not only understood what I said, but they thought it through several levels deeper. And today, every product is a security risk. Every device you add to your house, every IoT. And I think that you want to select an outsource partner who is aware, experienced, well-trained, and has the right partnerships with the AWSs or the Googles or the Microsofts of the world. Security is going to blow up one day. One day there's going to be a horrific event. We've already seen little ones, and it's suddenly going to become the most important thing. So the laws are starting to say security by design, privacy by design. What does this mean? It means that, at least in the United States and in Europe, they are trying to codify into law the idea that building a private secure system is a first-class requirement that goes before everything else. How they're going to enforce that, I don't know, but it just goes to show the importance. So when you're working with an outsourced vendor, engage in a dialogue about security. What does the product need to do? How are the people safe? How do we protect ourselves from each other? All of that. And my best advice to you is make it part of your software development lifecycle.
Yeah, that's good advice, Rich. And I think it segues to the next topic, which, if you're going through this list that we've kind of provided here, I think the next thing to consider is stability. I just talked to a company last night that reinvented themselves. They were an outsourcing company in Asia, and they failed. So they were in business for about a year, and then they just completely had to reinvent themselves and do something else. But it kind of brought up the fact that in the context of startups, I mean, you want to look at how long have these guys been around? Will they be in business next year? And so I think that looking at how long they've been around, if they've been around a long time, then they're probably going to be around next year, right? If they've only been around a year or two, then who knows? So I would look at the stability aspect a little bit.
Yeah, and look
And
at
then
the
I think
people too. Look at their past, right? Were
right.
they 10 years at their last job?
Sure. And I think the next item to consider is oversight. A good outsourcing company is going to have your best interest in mind, and they're going to manage the people, and they're going to make sure your code is safe, and they're going to take responsibility if something goes wrong. However, there's an overhead to doing all these things. So on the surface, you might think that you're going to save some money if you try to oversee everything yourself. Again, I'll give you another example that I've had in my life. I worked with a company once that had like 10 different engineers scattered around the world, and they were using subcontractors, and they were trying to manage all these different guys around the world. They had somebody in Brazil and somebody in China and somebody in Europe, and then they had a gap in one of the skill sets, and so they came to us, and I said, okay, well, like, should I assign a project manager to you? And he said, no, I want to do it all myself. And I said, okay. And I was just thinking about how much time he was wasting managing all of these individuals across the globe. And then if someone decided they wanted to work on something else and left, how was he going to replace them? Because, for example, the guy in Brazil that he had working for him had a very specific skill set. So he wasted a lot of time and he wasted a lot of money. And we ended up having to sever the relationship because, there was just no fixing that problem. So the advantage of a good outsourcing firm is that they will take care of your needs and they'll take care of that oversight for you.
And often in many levels, right?
Yeah,
There's
exactly.
the cultural example of pull requests and code reviews. But then there's also someone like me who will float around to the different teams and engage in conversations about how they're doing. And I have a very funny anecdote. My team's oversight and stability are so ingrained that the most average argument is everybody arguing, saying it was their fault that it went wrong, because everybody took ownership and believed it was their responsibility. And I love that. I short circuit that argument, of course, and say, no, it's my fault. I'm in charge, but thank you for your concern. And I believe this is a very important topic, Mark.
Sure. And I think that leads to the last item on the list, which is communication. And I think maybe, Rich, if you might want to talk about communication with an outsourcing company, because you've got the most recent experience of working as a customer.
And just a quick reminder before we do that. So we still have some time left for questions. So while we're covering our last topic, if you have any questions, you can use the chat. You can ask questions directly of the speakers or share them with all of the participants. So start doing that and we'll cover them after this.
Okay. And the harder, the better.
Yeah. So Rich, if you could just wrap up with communication, we'll take questions.
I'm going to make this fairly quick. Obviously, communication it's critical. I mean, if you can't communicate what you want, what you need, how you want to do it, you're nowhere. We're all looking for instant on development. We want to ramp up quickly. And there are certain tools which prove really useful in doing this. And today the tools are richer than ever. We have things like Slack, we have things like Jira, we have Confluence, we have wikis, and we have Zoom meetings. And I think that it isn't important which of these you use. It's important that you use them. And again, what I'd like to stress is you really want to instill a culture where every member of the team, I don't care if they're the note taker, if you have somebody who just takes notes, office manager, everyone should feel free to speak up if they see something. And I personally use a process called disagree and commit, which you can use to resolve arguments. That is a long discussion for another day, but it doesn't mean that all ideas are equal. It just means that all ideas are valued. And that's important. So communication right from the beginning, regular communication, a predictable cadence of communication, and quite often you will develop channels, like your project manager is going to be a main source of your communication, but your front end lead is going to be someone you talk to about something else. I love it when the team is comfortable talking to each other. We speak in English, we all understand each other, and communication is the winning ingredient for sure. The ethics and communication, if you have those covered, you're in good shape. So if you have specific questions about communications, please ask them, because I could talk for hours on that subject, but I won't.
We only have a few minutes.
Thank you, Rich. And thank you, Mark, for your time today. That was all good information. And before we proceed to questions, I know our speakers have prepared some special offers that will only be available for the webinar attendees. They're all here, but they will also be sent to you in your email after the event. You'll also receive the slides and you'll receive the recording of the webinar to review later. So let's open things up to questions now. And we have the first one. When the pandemic is over, should I visit the vendor office myself?
Mark, I'll let you also answer, but my belief is if you can, you should. I have just gotten incredible value out of my trips to Ukraine. Kharkiv, Ukraine has become one of my favorite cities in the world. It's safe. I walk around at night. Often I'm there with with Matt Brown. So I have, direct time. And I really got to know my teams. But more importantly, I met other members of Waverly who became future team members or future collaborators. And you could also see the professional operation, the security in the building, the city, the infrastructure. So yes, I think so. But don't feel bad if you can't afford to do it. Find another way. But if you can, do it. Mark?
Yeah, I'll agree with that. Before I worked at Waverly, when I was a customer of outsourcing, I went to several countries where the vendor was located, and it was always valuable. It's always great you can form a special connection that you can't get over Skype. But like Rich said, if you can't do it, you can still have a great success.
You learn a lot about the culture of the people too. Since I know we have a lot of Ukrainians watching right now, I'm going to share with you one of my favorite things about Ukrainians. They're very fierce, proud, and independent. They've achieved their own country. They're proud. They're strong. They don't want to fail, and they want to succeed. This reminds me a lot of Americans, except almost fiercer. And it makes me really bond with them because I dig that.
Great.
Thanks.
Arista, any other questions?
Yes, there's actually a great one. It was sent to us prior to the event, so somebody was really making sure we cover this today. When should I not use outsourcing?
Oh, I'll take that one. That's a great question. I think you should avoid outsourcing if you're not fully committed to making it work. In other words, there's going to be some overhead in adding a team of engineers, whether it's a project base or staff augmentation, and it will require some level of involvement. So if you think you can just throw everything over a wall and have it magically done, then you shouldn't engage.
And a second one might be if the governmental security regulations are such that the legal costs of just setting it up are so high. That's rarer though than the situation Mark described.
Right. Okay.
And there's another one. Is there an advantage to using an outsourcing company based in the USA?
Well, again, I'll take that one. And I would say yes. For one thing, this is assuming, of course, that the startup is in the US. For one thing, if you need to escalate a problem, there are people you can talk to during normal business hours. If the company's in the US, worst case is that, and if you need to, and as a last resort, you have some legal recourse. Most US based companies have errors and omission insurance. So you have some recourse if there's something, again, I'm talking worst case scenario. But if the company's based somewhere offshore, the legal entity is offshore, then it could be problematic, or impossible even to do anything about it if something went that wrong.
I'm gonna only slightly provide a different point of view. I wouldn't even consider it, doing it in the US. And the reason is price. No, I
don't think that was the question. It's the legal entity. So for example, Waverly's based, our legal entity is based in the US.
Got it. Fair enough.
Else. I think that was what the real question was.
Sure. And in that case, I 100% agree with you.
Okay, great.
Thank you. It's been an hour, and that's all the time we have for today. So I'd like to thank everyone for attending. And again, if you want access to the information presented today, a link will be sent shortly. You'll also receive the special offers. You have the contact information for our speakers right here. So if you have any additional questions that we didn't cover today, please feel free to reach out. So yeah, thank you, the speakers. Have a nice day, everyone, and hopefully see you at our other events soon.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you, Arissa. Thank you, Mark.
you.
And please feel free to introduce yourself to me.
Yep. Same here. Bye.
Bye.
Bye all.